Welcome back to the Business Leaders of America podcast, where business leaders come to share their advice and journeys to success with existing and emerging leaders of America. Join us as we delve into the minds of these accomplished individuals, uncovering the strategies and insights that have propelled them to the top. Whether you're an established leader or an emerging force in the business world, this podcast is your go-to source for the knowledge and inspiration needed to navigate the dynamic landscape of American business. Now, here's your host, Dylan Bloyd.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Business Leaders of America podcast. Today, we're excited to welcome Stephen Gaffney, a renowned expert in honest communication, change management, and building high-performing teams. With nearly 30 years of experience, Stephen has worked with top leaders and Fortune 500 companies like Amazon, Marriott, and Lockheed Martin, as well as the U.S. government and military. He is also an accomplished author, highly sought-after speaker, and advisor, helping organizations drive profit and success through practical, actionable strategies. Stephen is the author of several impactful books, including Just Be Honest, Honesty Works, and Be a Change Champion. His latest book, Unconditional Power, delves into leadership through the lens of honesty and communication, and we're eager to hear his insights on creating consistently high-achieving teams. Today, we'll dive into the strategies that have made Stephen a trusted advisor for so many top organizations and explore how leaders can apply these lessons to their own teams. Welcome to the show, Stephen.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. So if you could please give us a brief intro on yourself and how you got to where you are today.
Gosh, so I started almost 25, 30 years ago, but I kind of fell into this line of work. I was an agent for basically photographers and also film and radio commercial directors, but mainly photographers. And I started to do seminars for them on communication. And then that kind of evolved, and we're to the point where a graphic designer who saw me speak went home to her husband, who worked for IBM, and said, "You should bring this guy in because he's helpful and it's really great strategies." And so that's how I ended up into the corporate world. And of course, in my line of work, if you teach people strategies that work, then you'll get rehired. So I'm always focused on stuff that works as opposed to nice conceptual philosophical ideas. What do we actually do? So that's how I built my reputation.
Wow. Yeah, you mentioned spending nearly 30 years helping organizations build high-performing teams and increase profits through honest communication and change management. So what first inspired you to focus on these areas specifically? And why do you think they're so crucial in business success today?
Well, I kind of fell into what I ended up focusing on. And here's what I mean by that.
Yeah.
So what I focus on is honest communication and teamwork. But
Right.
the bread and butter, the foundational principle is about honest communication. And what I mean by honest communication is not about truth or lies. The biggest problem is not what people say. It's actually what they don't say to each other, what they leave out. So how do you get that unsaid said? How do you get that from others, which we can talk about? And how do we get our unsaid said so it's well received? But the way I started was because ever since I was a little kid, I was always honest. And people might say, "Oh, that's so nice." No, it was actually weird. Here's what I mean by that. I was the kind of kid that if I dented the coffee table, I would voluntarily tell on myself. Now, my brother and my sister, they'd be like, "I've never seen that coffee table."
Right, yeah.
Exaggerating. But the point being is, I was weirdly honest, and always forthcoming. So I've always had that as a principle. But you know what? People might say, "Okay, well, that's really good too." No, because I didn't know how to deliver the right communication. And as I got to being a teenager, I actually was kind of brutal with my honesty, and I didn't have that many friends, and I had to learn how to modify that. And so, but what I became aware of is how important honest communication done effectively makes a difference. And then ultimately what happened was a friend of mine said, "You should teach this stuff," because I was already beginning to do communication and motivation. I'm like, "People know this." And he goes, "No, they don't really know how to share difficult messages and have it go well." So I developed a 9-step formula on how to have an honest conversation with anyone and have it go well. And I delivered that for many years. People saved their marriage, got promoted, all incredible stuff. And that was the big breakthrough for my business. And then that led to teamwork.
Got it. Yeah. Why do you think it's so difficult for people to be honest, especially in the workplace? It just feels like, and I know it starts at the top, it seems like, because people feel like they can't be honest about certain things. But why do you think that there's still issues with it when management sometimes may be open to honesty and allowing them, there's still that dishonesty?
Well, because I think often people inadvertently punish people who are honest
Mm,
and are forthcoming. I mean, I'm sure this has happened to you, and I always raise this when I'm doing sessions and even coaching. I mean, have you ever had somebody say to you, Dylan, listen, you can tell me anything. I really appreciate any feedback. So you
yeah.
give them some constructive criticism and they start to get defensive.
Hmm.
They start to debate you, and you're like, okay, this is ridiculous. I bet you there's some people in your life, and not because I know you, we
Right.
just met, but there's some people probably in your life who have actually trained and conditioned you to not, for you to not tell them the truth because of the way they've reacted.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of times people inadvertently punish other people by getting defensive. So right away, if people are listening and going, that's me,
Yeah.
or maybe you're a small business owner, or you're running a large organization or whatever, and you've gotten defensive, you have to own up to it, apologize, and correct that. Otherwise, we will set the environment, the culture to not speak honestly, which is deadly to all organizations.
Mm. Do you feel like like people will follow suit the more honest you are? Have you seen that in your work where people start becoming more honest and it causes other people like a chain reaction to be more honest?
Absolutely. Again, it's follow the leader, right? You
Yeah.
could, and we lead up, we lead down, we lead
Right.
across. But I work with a lot of executives who I have to coach them on how to share difficult messages. Let me give you an example.
Yeah.
I work with a CEO who said, look, I'm being honest with the workforce and they don't like it. And he went on to share with me, I'm very forthcoming that we're having problems within the company. I said, well, that's not the problem. The problem is what you're not saying is all the solutions and how you're going to pull out of this and what you're going to do as an organization.
Mm.
So it's one thing to be forthcoming about complaining or an issue that's
Yeah.
legitimate, but we also have to add in potential solutions or where we're going to go with this. Otherwise, people might react.
Hmm.
So I always coach people like if you're going to go to your boss and you have something difficult to say it, but then also add in what your suggestions are to do about this. What are your
Mm.
potential solutions? So it does ultimately, people follow the leader. Success
Right.
stops, starts at the top. But are we forthcoming? So I've seen a lot of leaders that I've had to coach because they're not that vulnerable. They're
Yeah.
not sharing things, and then they're also not sharing about solutions. They have to be all of that. Otherwise, people don't follow that person, and they'll just disconnect.
Mm. Have you had difficulties dealing with top leaders trying to get them to be more vulnerable? Because I mean, I feel like that's such a huge issue in business today.
Well, because a lot of people have had bad things happen. And I've worked with executives who actually have had to share things and maybe even shared solutions, but essentially issues, and people didn't react well. So, again, I have had to coach them, focus on solutions, be fact-based, all things we can talk about.
Yeah.
But let's face it, a lot of us, this is easy to talk about, but most people have had a bad experience in business or their personal life where somebody has negatively reacted, or
Yeah.
maybe they've used the information against us.
Hmm.
Or have you ever had somebody who doesn't let go of an issue, how you burn them? Like we all make mistakes in life,
Right.
right? And so we apologize. But have you ever had somebody who just harps on that mistake? And you're like, my gosh, I should have never said anything. They're
Yes.
not letting it go. In fact, I came up with 12 essential elements on how to build a consistently high achieving team. So, how to build a great team.
Yeah.
There's 12 of them. And one of them is the frozen principle, letting it go. In other words, how do you let go of something and move forward? We need to and be able to move forward, and we have to get people to move beyond things. Otherwise, they're going to be stuck in the past. So
Yes.
again, this stuff sounds easy to talk about, but it isn't so easy, right? When
Hmm.
you really look at it, and we have to create that environment. We have to set the example, and by being forthcoming and sharing things, and then asking questions, and then being okay when we hear answers we don't like.
Right.
How are we reacting, and what are we going to do about it?
I love it because those can be used in any aspect of life, not just business. Because like you said, you've helped save marriages, you've helped with all that. So
Yeah.
I love that those can be, universally used and utilized. So you're known for
Let me
simple.
can I give you an
Yeah,
example of what I'm talking about in a way
yeah,
they may have people may have never thought of.
yeah,
Um, Being a great communicator also means great ability to listen to others. And so I had a client of mine who had problems with his teenage daughter. And when he shared this in the session, because sometimes people share personal stuff,
yeah,
people are like, oh, yeah, you know how teenagers can be. And then he went through the session, and I talked a big part about deeply listening beyond the words, really listening rather than transmitting. So often when two people are in a conflicting situation, if you pull them aside and you say, do you feel like the other person's listening to you? The other person will say, no, I don't feel like they're listening. So people in an argument tend to feel like the other person isn't listening. So what do? Listen first, deeply listen. So he took this principle home, and what he started to do was deeply listen to his teenage daughter. And at first she was kind of cautious, right? Where's this going?
Hmm.
But once she started to share things, and this time he didn't get defensive, he didn't react, it created that safe environment. And ultimately, she started to share more and more to the point where it completely transformed their relationship. So, one thing we have to look at is even when we're talking about getting the unsaid said, is our ability to really listen and listen beyond the words.
Mm.
Okay, so somebody's upset, but why are they upset? Why did they get upset about that? What's going on in their life? So, really probing, but creating that safe atmosphere. So that's an example of taking these principles that work in business, but also applying it at home.
Right. Yes, absolutely. I think that's a big part of it as well, because when you're not to pick on HR, but usually the conflicts or, the conflict resolution starts there, right? So a lot of the times people feel like they can't be as vulnerable because they can't speak about, you know, personal issues outside of work. They need to leave it at home, leave it at the door. So do you run into that a lot where businesses want to keep like the personal side of things out of the organization and just focus on business?
Well, the best organizations realize that when somebody is at work, you have to deal with a home and work.
Right.
And then actually, we just finished a draft of a book that's going to be coming out about scaling culture.
Mm.
And one of the things I'm bringing up in this book is culture today differs than culture before the pandemic. Here's what I mean. Before the pandemic, primarily people went to the office and worked. I mean, there were exceptions, and there's obviously many exceptions, but primarily that's how people thought of work. And there was a remote working, but basically coming to the office.
Right.
After the pandemic, a lot of people are at home and there's hybrid situations. Well, here's the interesting thing. We are a product of the 5 people we spend the most time with. Somebody once said this, and I found it so profound. So if I'm surrounded by who impacts me are the 5 people I spend the most time with, and I'm at home, even though I'm at work, that means what's happening at home is even more important and impacts me while at work, so to speak.
Mm.
So whether it's physically attending and going into the office or I'm at home, we have to really help people realize that culture is not just limited within the building. It actually is where everyone is at in different locations. So that actually changes the dynamic of how we look at culture, building a great atmosphere, which is what the book is all about. How do
Right.
you actually do that? But the point I want to make now is that we really have to treat that employee and not think they can just leave their personal life at work, and also the other way, work at home. And for a lot of people, they're at home. So even
Mhm.
if they're not, we have to look at the total person, and the best organizations realize that.
Right. I feel like that's such a complex issue, and you're changing culture, especially because I've even asked that question to panels. Usually the panel, nobody wants to answer it because they don't want to, for
Right.
one, it's a very complex answer or a long-winded answer, but majority of the time they don't want to answer that. So, but you're known for simplifying complex issues within organizations and including communication, challenging and team silos. Can you share a few of the common problems you see in businesses and how your chat approach addresses these issues?
I can, but I want to address what you're bringing up because I can answer
Okay.
about culture. What we need to do is codify the culture. So most organizations don't spend nearly enough time on this, and then they don't execute it well. Let me explain what I mean by that.
Okay.
If I think of my culture of a company or even a team within an organization, whatever it is, the culture as a set of values, that's not good enough. And here's the reason why. One is it doesn't differentiate organizations. And second, what does it actually mean? Let me explain what I mean by that.
Okay.
If I put integrity as a foundational principle of my company, all right, well, that sounds great. But here's the thing. Am I going to imply that other companies are like, we believe in not being in integrity? We believe in being dishonest.
Right.
Everybody says these things. So it
Yes.
doesn't really differentiate. The second thing it doesn't do is it doesn't spell it out. So instead of saying we believe in integrity or honesty or whatever, what about the important principle of proactively getting the unsaid said? proactively getting the unsets said. As an example, what I mean by that is that an expectation in people's job is you share issues and ideas, whether being asked or not, proactively. A
Yeah.
lot of times people don't share things because they don't think it's part of the job. But if you set that as an expectation, and that's part of what you codify your culture, that makes a difference. So here's where I'm headed with this.
Okay.
The problem is that organizations don't really spell out a set of expectations and how we're going to behave. They have these values that sound really nice, and then it doesn't, it means different things to other people, different people. And then if the organization is growing, for a lot of small companies, you can set the value pretty easily,
Yeah.
right? Within, because we kind of get it, but we have to codify it so that when we scale, it's actually people know what we're built on. So that's really critical. So I can come back and now and address the chat principle, but I wanted to directly address what I believe is a problem with culture is that people don't codify and are specific with the expectations. And that's something they can do. And the new book actually spells out the 9 most important principles to codify in any organization.
Is that relevant to any rapid change though in the organization, not just culture? Is that any kind of rapid change? Because a bunch of things, I mean, say you're changing a system, and it's happening overnight. Yes. Is it relative to that as well?
Yes, because these are expectations on how we're behaving, but they're not meant to handcuff us. It's meant to build. Okay. Let me give you an example of one of the foundational expectations. Innovate daily. The idea is, okay, we can always create new products and new products and services, but how about the expectation that we are supposed to innovate daily? In other words, if something isn't working, or if it's working okay, innovate, keep changing it and doing things different. So these principles aren't meant to handcuff, and no matter what people create, we're not trying to handcuff people. We're trying to grow and adapt, because growth and change is really critical. As I always say, if we're not progressing in life, we are regressing. There is no such thing as status quo. There never has been. There's never been a time in history we said, okay, we got it. Yeah. And now it stays. Yeah. It's either we're progressing. Even interpersonal relationships are that way. We're either advancing or we're regressing. I was having dinner the other day with a friend of mine, a couple friend of mine, and we were just talking about the importance of growth in a relationship. It's always be growing. And why a lot of people end up getting divorced or there's problem is because one person grows and the other person is not. In other words, we're either growing or if we're not progressing, we're regressing. So this is important because we have to instill the principle in all organizations that we are always going to be changing. So when employees go, when is this going to end? I'm fatigued, right? The idea is never. We're always going to be changing. One of the foundational principles of a great team is always be changing, essentially, never satisfied. Great athletes, great teams are never satisfied. Whatever they're doing, they're celebrating their success. And then they're saying, okay, now how can I make it better? So if we are not progressing, we are regressing. There is no such thing as status quo.
I love that you touched on professional athletes. For example, quarterbacks. People don't see all the work that's going into it. What they're doing they're not remaining great because they're just doing the same thing over and over. They're continuing to work at their craft and be better, consistently. So, and it could be across every industry that we're speaking about. So thank you for touching on that. I'd love for you to touch a little bit on the chat approach though.
Sure. So I developed this terminology called consistently high achieving teams, a chat. And I draw the difference between a chat, a consistently high achieving team, and high performing teams. I think the terminology high performing teams is not good enough. There's a next layer up. Okay. And here's what I mean by that. The word performing can be confused with hard work. And that's not really what we're after in today's work world and in our lives. We're after achievement. So have you ever said to somebody, look, I want you to do this. And they say, Dylan, what do you want me to do? I'm working really hard. Yeah. You're like, that's not the problem. It's not producing the results. We're not achieving what we need to achieve. So I put in the word achieving versus performing like an upgrade. And then it's important to do this consistently because we can drive a team, we can drive a relationship, and a team is 2 or more people to have achievement. But the question is, why are some teams consistently high achieving teams and others are just a high achieving team? It kind of goes up and down, up and down. Right. So what is it about consistently high achieving team? There's 12 essential elements to a consistently high achieving team. One we covered earlier, letting it go, the frozen principle, letting it go, but the ability to learn and move forward. But there's 11 others. We can cover some of them or wherever you want to go with this. But whatever the key principle is, even if we didn't know the 12, what I would caution people is to stop using high performing teams and instead start talking about consistently high achieving teams, because the word achievement is about producing results. Let me give you a quick example. I have a client right now that took that terminology, not even the 12 essentials. I mean, they've done a lot with that, but just that terminology. And they look at all the bureaucracy now within their organization as, is it achieving or are we performing? They've used that distinction to clean out a lot of process and procedures that were bogging down the organization to produce. And so to free people up so that they could produce better results. So even switching out the word performing and achieving or drawing that distinction can bring a lot of great results, even without the 12 essentials. And of course, the 12 essentials are all the tools on how to do this.
So how does it work specifically for you and your business, Stephen? So do businesses reach out to you because they're struggling and they need assistance? I mean, you've worked with so many high-level businesses, but when you go in to work with them, are you, getting a brief understanding of what they have going on? Are you, are they sending you information beforehand, or do you go on site? How does it work for you?
So first of all, primarily all the work we do is all word of mouth. I mean, it's great about if somebody hears about us and contacts us, and if they're listening to this podcast and they even just want to talk about a problem and they're not even sure about it, whether they'd hire us, just call us and we're going to help you out in some way, whether or not you hire us or not. That's my promise always. But so a lot of it is word of mouth. And here's the thing though, a lot of people who hear what we do think, well, it's when a team is struggling. But we also work with a lot of teams that are really great and just taking it to the next level. Just last week, I was working with a team that actually was doing really well, but they were pretty independent of each other. So my client thought, if we can get them to even more collaborate, as good as it is, we're going to turn that good team to a great team. So sometimes that's the case. Sometimes I've worked with fantastic teams, but they want to think about, okay, how do I make it even better? Like they're already collaborating, but what's that competitive edge? And then, of course, we have worked with a lot of teams that are struggling, but we've also done work and do a lot of work with companies that are buying another company, because a big problem that a lot of companies have when they buy another company is the culture fit. So how do you get people to interact fast, right, and with speed to work as one and one great team, one great organization? So we've worked a lot with organizations that have bought other organizations. And so all different ways on how to do this. Even we've worked with a lot of, I've even done a lot of sessions, just going off the top of my head, of just other interesting things where I've taken the company and their customer and we put them in the same room and actually created a great team atmosphere. So actually, instead of it being, versus each other, they're actually working as one, which has helped the company grow their business and the customer get great service and great results. So it's a win-win for everyone. It's just use these principles in all different ways.
Right. Oh, that is amazing. Anyone who's listening, like Stephen just mentioned, if your business is doing great, we want to continue to achieve. We want to continue to improve. So the services are not just if you're struggling, it is for both, right? So being that you've worked with Fortune 500 companies, like we mentioned in the intro, Amazon, Marriott, Lockheed Martin, are there specific lessons from your work when you work with these industry giants that small and mid-sized business owners can apply to their own teams?
There's a lot. So let me give you three in particular. First, they think big. They're always thinking huge. And that may sound kind of obvious, but small companies sometimes are not thinking large enough, or they're looking at it as a dream, but they don't execute on those dreams. But great companies think we have to always be improving, right? If we're not progressing, we are regressing. Second, they codify things. We talked about culture, but process and procedures so that actually we can run, so it's building the foundation. Some organizations, and we've worked with a lot of small businesses, they don't think about building that foundation because they're like, no, everything's great. It is great, but once it scales and moves forward, that becomes a problem. And the third thing is big organizations focus on teams, because if you think about it, nothing gets achieved alone. We always need a great team. So sometimes small businesses kind of have that hero mentality, oh, I'm going to get it done. And they do. But great teams, great organizations understand it's made up of a whole bunch of teams. So how do I create that high achieving team atmosphere and execution within the entire organization? So whether they're using us or whatever the case, they're very conscious that nobody succeeds alone. We have to act as one, and we have to think about building great teams.
Mm. Are you working with some small and mid-sized businesses currently, or is it majority of the bigger businesses still that you're working with?
It's a great question. So we target larger businesses, and here's the reason why, is because larger businesses, once they hear of what we do and we do the work, they tend to rehire us. And so it's an easy business model.
Mm.
Having said that, we've also, and I have worked with a lot of small businesses, sometimes just really interesting dynamics where it's a husband and wife and they've had their best friends in the organization, all kinds of interesting dynamics, very small organizations as well. We just target the large ones, but the small ones come our way. And of course, I love working with small businesses because I can appreciate that, obviously, being a small business person. But also, I really believe that, big businesses were ultimately a small business. So what makes them grow? And by us having worked with the large businesses, I can help the small businesses realize what needs to get done. We talked about three things earlier, but there are other things, right? As well as what do big companies do that we can actually take and use in a small company. So I love working with all different companies. We just tend to target larger ones just simply because it's an easier business model.
Right. Oh, that is amazing. Well, Stephen, I did want to shift gears a little bit. For those of you who don't know, Stephen is a cancer survivor, and you speak a little bit about how it's shaped your perspective on leadership and on life. So how would you say it's influenced the way you approach building high-achieving teams and organizations?
So the way I think about things, first of all, let me just say something about cancer.
Yes.
I went through testicular cancer, which when you look at the whole scheme of things, it's an easier cancer to take care of. Many people go through a lot tougher things. What I realized out of that, among many things, is it was a huge wake-up call. Of course, health and loving people, and for now, who knows about the future. But one of the big ahas for me is that every problem creates an opportunity. I'm not saying every problem is a good thing. Like, I would never wish cancer on anyone.
Right.
But the way I think about things is, given that you go through difficult times, let's say cancer, what's the opportunity that you're going to take from that so you're moving forward in your life? And for me, it was a wake-up call I just mentioned, and specifically about not putting things off. I used to tend to put things off. Well, I'll get to it. I still put some things off, but I don't live for the future. I live much more for, if not now, the immediate future. So right now. So if you were to say, well, what's your business going to be like in 5 years? I could talk to that, but my thought is, who knows whether I'm around, who's around. I don't have a death sentence, and I'm not thinking something bad's going to happen, but I cherish much more the immediate moment and the close future. So it has changed. And why and how this changes how I look at teams is I'm all about speed. I'm very impatient. People got to move now. People say, well, we're going to look at this and do something in 2 years. I'm like, who knows what's going to happen in 2 years? Make it happen now. So one of the principles in the 12 essential elements is move with speed by knowing when good enough is good enough. In other words, speed. So as though I've always been somewhat impatient, but I'm always encouraging people, you can move faster and faster. I mean, just look at right now, SpaceX versus Boeing, right? Let's take that as an example. SpaceX has done incredible things. What have they had? 15 launches. Now they just caught a rocket. Boeing still hasn't gotten their astronauts back in space. Now, and they have way more resources than SpaceX. So we can rationalize it. We can say, what are they doing differently? SpaceX has changed the way we look at the speed of the future coming at us. AI is also influencing us, all these things. So how cancer has impacted me is really thinking about moving fast and enjoying your life now.
I love that, because when situations like that happen, so often people will look at it as a negative. It's almost like a poor me, and then it's just like, yes, I survived it, thankfully, but it's like, constantly dwelling on it compared to what you did and turned into a positive and continue to want to live your life to the fullest, because at the end of the day, everything in life is temporary, right?
Yes. Yep. And that's where I want to come back to this point about a frame in life that I found very useful. All problems create opportunities. Again, I'm not saying all problems are a good thing, But when things happen, what's the opportunity? So I even see in discussions and team atmospheres and organizations that are admiring the problem versus, okay, it is a problem. I'm not trying to sugarcoat it and everything lemon and lemonades or trying to use some trite phrase. What I'm trying to say is it's a problem.
Yeah.
So what's the opportunity? Are we going to spend time discussing about the problem? Are we going to discuss what's the opportunity it gives us? So an example might be, let's say you lose a significant piece of business. That's a problem and it hurts revenue and profit. You can sit there and wallow in it, or you can say, what are the lessons we're going to draw from this? And anytime we blame other people, we give out control. Like, well, the competitor did something disadvantage and we didn't see that coming. That doesn't put you in control. What I would say is, okay, why weren't we close enough to the customer or potential customer? What questions did we miss? What did we miss? What could we have focused on differently? What lessons are we going to learn so we're going to be better at it than ever before? So back to my cancer experience. In 2009 is when I went through the cancer experience, but it was also the time of the Great Recession. And so as many people know, one of the first things to go in a recession is things that we do, like consulting and stuff like that. Now, I don't agree with that, but that's what they tend to do. And so I didn't focus. I couldn't do anything that I had cancer, but I could do something about how I was going to respond to the cancer.
Right.
I couldn't do anything about our country faced with recession, but I could do something on how I looked at my business faced with a recession. So I focused 100% of my energies on what I was in control of. I retooled my business. I took that as an opportunity, a wake-up call of sorts too, in redoing things and altering our message. And from that year on, we've had our best years in business. It's not that I'm that smart, that's up for people to decide. But what the key is, I'm focused on what's the opportunity rather than focusing on the problem. So focus on the opportunity, not the problem.
Right. You adapted. You didn't just, accept the environment and accept, the economy for what it was. You adapted and made something of it, right?
Exactly. I mean, you just think about, and people who are listening to this podcast or watching it, you could just watch other people's conversations in life and how much they're focused on discussing the problem versus, okay, what are we going to do about it? It is a problem. There's certain things that are bad things, but what are we going to do about it?
Yes.
So focusing what's within our control, not what's without it. Even in people's relationships, interpersonal relationships, we can sit there and blame other people, but let's focus, what could we do better that might impact others? And, and sometimes somebody will say, well, people don't change, right? Well, they say that, but that's ridiculous.
Right.
What would we be if the greatest leaders of our time, Gandhi and Martin Luther King and many, many others, who, if they thought people can't change, people can change if they really want to. So how do we get others to change? It's by changing ourselves first. Set the example.
Oh, I love that so much. Thank you for touching on that and taking a stroll down the vulnerable side of things. I do appreciate it. So I did want to talk to you about your book. Can you share what inspired you to write your newest book, Unconditional Power, and give us a glimpse into what readers can expect from it?
So Unconditional Power is the name of the book. And I wrote it or started to think about and writing it for myself. First, so let me explain what I mean by that. The book is all about when we're in a good mood, we're smarter, right? We kind of all intuitively know that, right?
Right.
So what do we do when we're not in a good mood? How do we bounce back? And then how do we get others to be in a good mood so they're smarter and we produce more results? Well, I've suffered from moods. Now, I was never clinically depressed per se, but I was the kind of person that if something bad would happen, I would eventually bounce back, but it would be eventual. Like, so if I got an email that bothered me, I would take it to heart. And, I'd say, or maybe it's a bad conversation or whatever the case may be. And ultimately, again, I would bounce back and draw lessons learned and move forward. But what I started to realize is some people were really quick at bouncing back, no matter what happened to them in life. They're like, yeah, that's the case, but they move fast. So the book became, is a result of a study of me studying people. Why do some people bounce back and always be in a good mood, most of the time anyway, and others wallow? And what can we do to ourselves so we can change our mood, morale, and produce better results? And really, how as leaders, because we lead up, we lead down, we lead across, how can we lead others to change their mood and morale very quickly? So there's specific strategies in there. An example would be about intentional disruption. Intentional disruption is when we feel a bad mood coming, right? And so what do? We disrupt that mood. There's two types, physical and mental. And so this is just one of a little aspect of the book. Well, the idea of physical would be like you're sitting at your desk and you get something bad coming across your desk. If you stay there, you're going to wallow in it. So maybe what you do is you get up, you exercise, you do something, or you watch a funny video, you do something that changes you physically around that. But the real key is mental intentional disruption through the art of a question. So here's a good example. You're sitting in a conversation and somebody's complaining and belly aching about something.
Yeah.
And you're like, gosh, what am I going to do? We can be upset, or we can say, wow, that's really troubling. So what would you suggest? If you start to say, what would you suggest to a complainer, whoever asks the questions controls the conversation. So we're redirecting their focus on the complaint into what's potentially a solution. So there's other great questions we can go through, but what would you suggest is a really good one. Here's another one. What would it take for you to agree? So when somebody's like, well, I disagree, what would it take for you to agree? You're changing the direction. But one of my favorites is, can you live with it?
Right.
If you ever had a conversation with somebody and they're like, and you get drawn into it and you're like, my gosh, this is a dumb conversation.
Yeah.
How you can get out of it and say, okay, look, we disagree, but is this a deal breaker or can you live with it? So, and there are many, many other questions, but intentional disruption is something we can do to others, but also questions we can ask ourselves to redirect when we're going in the wrong direction to go in the right direction.
Wow. I like that. I can't wait to pick up the book, because it's one thing to control your own emotions, but to help others control their emotions in a way of asking questions. I mean, that's incredible, especially as a leader, because of all the emotions that go on in the day-to-day, to be able to have those questions that might be able to shift the person's, emotions. I mean, that's incredible. So I'm excited to pick that up.
And let me just say this is a critical skill set for leaders.
Right.
Because if your organization is stressed out, or even if it's a small business or a small team, or whatever it is, if they're stressed, if they're upset, they're not as productive. They're not as innovative. They're not as, they don't have that ability to change as well. So we can say, well, they just have to deal with it. But if you just say that, you're not going to get the best results. Great leaders know how to readjust and get other people in a good mood. And this is not about a bunch of happy talk.
Right.
This is what do we do so people have a better mindset to tackle the problem. Mood and morale and mindset matters.
No, absolutely. Especially when you're spending all the time, majority of your life at the place of work, spending more time there than you are with your family majority of the time, right? Unless you're, of course, like you said, working from home or hybrid, whatever it may be. But when you're spending that much time at work, you want to be in a good mood. You want your leaders to be there for you. And as a leader, you want to make sure that your team enjoys coming to work every day. And like you said, it's not all, happy rainbows and, daisies, but at the same time, why not at sometimes, so it should be a good time.
And here's a great thing that I wrote the book for this way, is that it's not only stuff you can use at work, but you can use at home.
Yes.
These are the same principles to change the mood and morale of relationships at home. I'll share with you a funny example.
Yeah.
So it's in the book, but essentially I switched out the names and stuff like that to protect people's privacy. But I had a little dinner party and I had this couple over, and they are great, but sometimes they start arguing, and when they argue hard.
Right.
And so have you ever been around one of those couples, or maybe friends or whatever, and you're like, you can feel that the whole conversation is going to go like the Titanic?
Yes.
So I was like, and then we get upset with them, right?
Right.
So like, okay, what do I do? So I used intentional disruption. I said, hey, I know you all are upset, but I have a question. And, they both looked at me and I said, well, what do you love about each other? I'm just wondering, and, the lady, friend of mine, she goes, well, I mean, I do love that he has a good sense of humor and he usually has my back, and I appreciate that. And then he said, she's not all that bad. They started laughing and they go back and forth. And so I totally disrupted it. And they even know the strategy. In fact, when I came out with the book, although I changed the name or whatever, they called me and they saw it. They're like, is that us?
That's
and
us.
I'm like,
yeah.
Absolutely. But I've had people use this on me too when I'm in a bad mood, right? We all suffer from this, but I tend to use it on myself as well. But the point is, we can use these strategies at work and at home. And again, it goes back to my earlier point about culture. We have to think of culture and what people are going through, not within just the borders of the the company, the walls of the company, but also people's home life impacts business and business impacts their home life. So developing principles that help out employees in all different ways is critical to today's success.
Right. No, it's that's really funny because I know a couple, few couples like that actually, and so I know that if I were to ask that question, there's probably going to be a good sarcastic answer coming back from both of them, but at least it changes, it shifts
It
their
does.
energy and shifts them from, saying something funny and then probably not being at each other's, throats.
Yes.
Yeah.
Somebody once said this to me years ago, and it really has helped me. Whoever asks the questions controls the conversation.
Right.
It's not whoever's talking, but you can redirect conversations through questions, right? I'm
Yes.
sure you've done podcasts where, all right, it's going in the wrong direction. Hopefully
Yep.
this one's going in the right direction, but
Yes.
I'm sure you've
Yes.
had ones where it's gone in the wrong direction, but you've been able to redirect it by just asking a different question.
Yep.
So instead of being upset at the transmitter, the person who's talking, just redirect it with a better question or a different question. Whoever asks the question controls the conversation. So what are the questions we're asking other people? And what are the questions we're asking ourselves?
Right. Such a great piece of information and great, ideas for people to use in the workplace, at home. So thank you for touching on that, Stephen. I do appreciate it. So how can listeners connect and learn more about you as well as pick up your book, Unconditional Power, and honestly, all the other books that you have, because these seem to be incredible, incredible resources.
Thank you. So if they contact us through our website, justbehonest.com, and that actually is the title of the very first book I wrote.
Mm.
And if I'm going to offer people something, if they mention your show,
Yeah.
they mention your show and they share that what they did with this information. So all they have to do is mention it, share they tried something, intentional disruption, talked about culture, did something,
Yeah.
and they put that in an email. We'll send them the very first book I wrote, Just Be Honest, that goes through a really critical distinction and how to have great conversations. We'll send it to them for free. So we'll send them, it'll be the electronic version,
Yes.
but we'll send them that. I mean, and people say, are you offering something that doesn't cost? No, I mean, you go to the website, it costs something, but I'm going to offer it for free. All they have to do is mention mention your show and mention that they tried some strategy, and we'll send that to them electronically for free.
Hmm.
So all they have to do is go to our website, justbehonest.com, and there's a place to say contact. And then you just say, saw Dylan's podcast. It was really great. Use this at home and at work, and we'll send them Just Be Honest for free.
Oh, thank you so much for that. Anyone who's listening, I mean, rewind this episode, find something in there. There is a ton of information that Stephen has touched on, and I'm sure it'll be very useful. I mean, tons of information you can use at home, at work. I mean, incredible. So thank you for that. And plus, you get a free book out of it. So amazing. All right, Stephen. Well, thank you so much, man. This has been incredible. I do have one more question before we go. I always like to end the conversation with some advice for entrepreneurs. So, what advice would you offer to entrepreneurs and business leaders who are looking to implement more honest communication and change management strategies in their businesses, but aren't sure where to start?
So first of all, on honest communication and things as a whole, codify your culture. In other words, what are specifically important to you that as you're building your organization? So three in particular is how I founded my company, essentially. And that is proactively getting the unsaid said. The expectation is that when people have an issue that they share it, and also ideas that second was make and keep commitments without following up. So I don't want to do any babysitting. That if we make a commitment, myself included, that we are to do what we say we're going to do. And if we get behind, then we use the proactive, honesty. But the bottom line is we make and keep commitments. And the third thing is straight line communication. We have an issue, we go direct to someone. I'm rattling off these three in particular because I think they're foundational, but whatever it is, what's your non-negotiables that you're building your business? The second thing overall I would advise people to do is be willing to adjust based on feedback. So a lot of times when we're building a business, I find people are too attached that it has to be their way. But keep thinking, as they say, of the end in mind. So make the adjustments, right? You learn feedback. So I started working with teams by accident because I was teaching honest communication. And a client of mine years ago said, can you do this in like a small team atmosphere and facilitate them to have conversations and produce better results? I was like, yeah, of course I can. But I had not thought to apply it to a small team.
Yeah.
So we did that, and then I built content from there. But it all came from a great idea from a customer of mine. So we have to listen to our customers. So that would be the second thing, be willing to adjust. And the third thing is don't quit. Just don't quit. Keep going. Do not lose sight of your dream. Sometimes dreams take a little bit different shape, but never quit.
Mm,
Always keep going until you win.
the power of one more day, right? I mean, that's incredible. Thank you. Thank you so much for touching on this. And Stephen, thank you for spending time with us today. It's been amazing.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for having me.